Well, dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome all to this month's edition of the Transylvania Lectures. It is with great pleasure that we gather here today to provide a platform for intellectual discourse and exchange. We aim to invite esteemed academics from all around the world who can shed light on topics not only pertinent to the Transylvanian society, but also to the wider intellectual sphere. It is my distinct honor to introduce our esteemed guest and the topic of today's lecture. We extend our sincere gratitude to Reverend Professor Nigel Biggar, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, until 2022. He had the esteemed position of Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford. We are privileged to have you here with us, and Professor Biggar, and we appreciate your acceptance of our invitation. Additionally, I would like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Hunyadi Gábor Attila. Dr. Hunyadi is an associate professor at the Babes-Bolyai University and a respected lecturer at MCC. We are delighted to have him guide us through today's discussion. The theme of today's lecture is the decolonization controversy and its relevance to Romania. This thought-provoking topic will undoubtedly spark insightful conversations and challenge our perspectives. Without further ado, I invite Professor Biggar to commence his lecture. The stage is yours, professors.
Please. Thanks. Please sit down. Fine, okay. You may start. Good. Thank you very much indeed, Mathieu, for your warm introduction, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you for listening to me in English. I can't speak Hungarian, so I'm glad that you're willing to listen to me in English. My voice is a soft one. If you can't hear me, raise your hand and I'll speak louder. I had been to Cluj, Colejvar, once before in my life, but that was 50 years ago in 1973 when I drove through Cluj on my way to Turkey. But I've seen more of Cluj this morning than I saw then, so I'm glad to have been here. I've chosen to speak about a topic that I am talking about a lot at the moment because I published a book 3 months ago called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. So this topic is on my mind all the time, but it seems to me that the topic is not on your mind all the time, because this discussion is primarily an Anglo-Saxon discussion. It's what British people talk about, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, to some extent Americans. But I thought you might be interested to hear what the controversy is about.
May I borrow your book?
You may borrow my book. You can just borrow it. So what I want to do in 20 minutes is to introduce the controversy over decolonization to you. Then I'll give you a summary of what I say in my book. And then thirdly, I will make one or two suggestions about how the topic of colonialism might bear upon Romania and Hungary. But I rely on Dr. Hunyadi to make the connections, and perhaps you too. So first of all, the decolonization controversy in the English-speaking West. So colonialism has become very controversial in Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and to some extent the United States in the last 3 or 4 years. one interesting question is why that has been the case. Why is colonialism an issue now? Because historically speaking, it's very odd. Since when set in a global historical context, the emergence of European overseas empires from the 15th century onwards and the English Empire from the late 1500s is quite unremarkable. So I'm talking here about European overseas empires, the kind of empires that you in Romania and Hungary have experienced. The Ottomans, the Austro-Habsburg empires are different. These were land-based empires. The Western European ones, the British one, was mainly overseas. And one of the main motives for overseas empire was trade. So the fact that Europeans have been involved in empire is not remarkable, because an empire is simply a single state containing a variety of people, one people of which is dominant, and as a form of political organization, empire has been around for thousands of years and has appeared on every continent. The Assyrians were doing empire in the Middle East over 4,000 years ago. They were followed by the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. In the 6th century BC, the Carthaginians established a series of colonies around the Mediterranean. Then came the Athenians, followed by the Romans, and after them the Byzantine rump. Empire first appeared in China in the 3rd century BC, and despite periodic collapses, it still survives today. From the 7th century AD, Muslim Arabs invaded east as far as Afghanistan and west as far as central France. In the 15th century, empire proved very popular. The Ottomans were doing it in Asia Minor and Southeast Europe, the Mughals in the Indian subcontinent, the Incas in South America, and the Aztecs in Mesoamerica. Further north, a couple of centuries later, the Comanche extended their imperial sway over much of what is now Texas, while the Ashanti were expanding their control in West Africa. And in the 1820s, King Shaka led the Zulus in scattering other South African peoples to several of the four winds. So European involvement in empire is not remarkable. What is remarkable, however, is that the contemporary controversy about empire and colonialism shows no interest at all in any of the non-European empires, past or present. European overseas empires are its sole concern, and of these, above all others, the English, or as it became after the Anglo-Scottish Union in 1707, the British one, is the main focus of attention. Why? Why now? I think the reason for this focus is that the real target of today's left-wing anti-imperialists or anti-colonialists is the West. Or more precisely, the Anglo-American liberal order that's prevailed since 1945. And this order is supposed to be responsible for the economic and political woes of the global South. Allegedly, it continues to express the characteristic white supremacism and racism of the old European empires, displaying arrogant, ignorant disdain for non-Western cultures and thereby humiliating non-white peoples. And it presumes to impose alien values and to justify military interference. The British Empire is proxy for the West, and the assault on its record is really an assault on the record of the West. So I think the current controversy over colonialism, therefore, is primarily about the present, not the past. Or rather, it is about the past only because it is about the present. And in fact, I think that the controversy about colonialism has been imported into Britain and Canada and Australia and New Zealand largely from the United States, where the focus there is on race. And the argument of the anti-colonialists is that white Anglo-Saxon countries are systemically racist, and that our systemic racism is due to our colonial history, and therefore we have to repudiate our colonial history in order to free ourselves of racism. So that's what I want to say about the current controversy. So let me now talk a bit about the heart of my book, the argument in my book about colonialism, and I focus on British colonialism because it's the one I know most about, and because it was the largest overseas European empire, and it's the one that is most often subject to criticism. Like any long-standing state, and I speak here as a Christian, so I don't expect of any human polity, of any state, of any imperial state, I don't expect moral perfection, I expect human limitation, and I expect human sin. So like any long-standing state, the British Empire presided over tragic evils and grave injustices during its 300-year life, roughly from, well, maybe 400-year life, roughly from 1600 to 1960, 360 years, stretching from Newfoundland in Canada to New Zealand, southeast of Australia. The British Empire presided over the following evils and injustices. Brutal slavery from 1650 to 1800, the epidemic spread of disease, economic and social disruption, the unjust displacement of native peoples by settlers, elements of racial alienation and racist contempt, policies of needlessly wholesale cultural suppression, miscarriages of justice, instances of unjustifiable military aggression, and the failure to admit native talent to the higher echelons of colonial government. All those things were wrong and lamentable. So in my book I don't pretend the British Empire or any other European empire was perfect. It wasn't. So that's all in the, if you're drawing up a kind of moral account of British Empire, you have in the debit column, you have all those instances of evil and injustice. But there's also a credit column of benefits. So, for example, if the British Empire presided as it did over slave trading and slavery from roughly 1650 to 1800, it was also among the first states in the history of the world to abolish slave trading and slavery throughout its dominions from about 1807 onwards. Denmark was the first northwestern European country to abolish slave trading in 1804. But afterwards, Britain, because of its triumph in the Napoleonic Wars, then led Europe, and this includes the United States, in suppressing the slave trade and slavery from Brazil across Africa, India to Malaysia. In addition, the empire also moderated the disruptive impact of European modernity on a very unmodern society. So one of the reasons that native peoples in Australia and North America and Africa suffered when European empires appeared on their shores, or European colonists appeared on their shores, was that the gap in cultural progress and sophistication was vast. So Europeans and British in the 1800s were at the height of their technological and scientific progress, and they met cultures that were very undeveloped comparatively, and the conflict was severe. But one effect that the imposition of colonial or imperial government had was to moderate the impact of settlers on natives. The empire also created regional peace by imposing an overarching imperial authority on otherwise warring native peoples. It promoted a worldwide free market, which allowed native producers and entrepreneurs new opportunities. It involved representatives of native peoples in the lower echelons of government. It sought to relieve the plight of the rural poor. It sought to overcome famine in India. It provided a civil service and judiciary that was generally and extraordinarily incorrupt. And it the British Empire brought up three of the most prosperous and liberal states now on earth: Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It gave birth to two more, the United States and Israel. And from May 1940, when France fell to Nazi Germany, until June 1941, when Germany invaded Soviet Russia, the British Empire offered Nazi Germany the only military opposition, with the exception of Greece. So what I say is, the British Empire and other European empires, like most states, did bad things, did good things. So you have evils and goods. I don't think you can do a cost-benefit analysis and say that one weighed more heavily than the other, because the evils and goods are of such different kinds. How much racism is worth the immunization of so many million people from disease? How much racism is worth it? You can't compare the two. How many unjustly killed people are worth the blessings of imperial imposed peace? How much humanitarian anti-slavery makes up for the evils of slavery? I don't think you can answer those questions. So I don't think we can tell whether an empire or a state did more good than evil, because the goods and evils are such different kinds. So how do we judge whether an empire was justified or not? Well, I think what we can do is to try and discern the central values or principles that were consistently expressed, and the goals that were pursued and realized more or less. If these were gravely evil and immoral, we can say that the imperial rule was systemically unjust. And if it wasn't systemically unjust, then we can say it was systemically just, more or less. Now, the obvious candidate for a systemically unjust regime is, of course, the Nazi regime in Germany from the mid-1930s until 1945. That regime was dominated by the mind of one man, and it was violently racist, and its aggressive expansionist nationalism was not burdened by much moral scruple. The death factories devoted to processing millions of Jews in the middle of the exigencies of war were not incidental to the regime, and that the Nazis pursued the final solution in the middle of a war. So important was the annihilation of the Jews to them. So we could say that this expresses the heart of Nazism. So we could say in that case, even though the Nazis built autobahns, which they did, that doesn't compensate for the centrally evil nature of the regime. Can we say the same of the British Empire? Well, the anti-colonialist critics, the left-wing critics, try and assimilate the British Empire to Nazism. So there are claims that the British committed genocide in Tasmania, that Cecil Rhodes, the late 19th century imperialist, was South Africa's Hitler, that the so-called concentration camps during the Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899-1902 in South Africa, that those are equivalent somehow to the Nazi concentration camps, and so forth. I won't go into detail now, but in my book, in the conclusion of my book, I conclude that it is entirely inappropriate to liken the British Empire to Nazism, and that it wasn't essentially racist or disproportionately violent, nor, with due respect to Marxist critics, was it essentially exploitative. From the early decades of the 19th century, its natural, innocent concern to promote trade and maintain strategic advantage were increasingly supplemented and tempered by Christian humanitarianism, a commitment to public service, and a liberal vision of political life. And in addition, the empire had mechanisms for self-correction. So often what would happen is that imperial rulers in London would constrain and hold accountable colonial governments, and humanitarian lobbyists in London would lobby the imperial government to come to the aid of native peoples being oppressed by settlers in Australia and North America. So it had a capacity for self-correction. And it also had a strong and growing liberal political vision. So the British learnt from the American War of Independence when the first British Empire disappeared because the American colonies fought and won their war and became independent. And the British realised that they could not hold on to their dominions tightly. And so from 1867 onwards, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa became increasingly independent. And after the First World War in 1919, India was set on the same track to become independent. And from about 1916, the vision of the British Empire as a commonwealth of independent nations began to gain momentum. So my view is that although the British Empire contained both good and evil, it was not essentially evil. It was capable of learning from its mistakes and correcting itself, and it had strong humanitarian and liberal strands that became stronger throughout its career, and the fact that the empire exhausted itself in 1939 to 45 fighting Nazi Germany says something about its nature. I know about the imperial nature of Britain's war against Nazi Germany because my own father fought in the British Army in Italy, and at one point in 1944 he was mistaken for an Indian because his skin colour had gone black from being in North Africa, and some Americans were looking for the Indian division, which was over to the right of his British unit in northern Italy, because Indians were fighting in Italy with the British against Nazi Germany. And in North Africa there were New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, West Africans as well. Okay, so that's the conclusion I reach in my discussion of the British Empire in my book. So finally, what's this got to do with you? You can tell better than I can, but here are two suggestions. I can see 2 points of possible relevance to Romania and Hungary. One is the role of imperial authority in moderating interethnic conflict. So one advantage that the imposition of an overarching authority can have on territories involving lots of different kinds of people is that it helps to moderate and arbitrate conflicts between those peoples. And when the imperial authority is lifted, then you have the problem of minorities being stranded in new independent nation states. And that has happened. That happened in Britain when Ireland became independent in 1922. Northern Ireland did not become independent, but there was a Catholic nationalist Irish minority stranded in Northern Ireland because the overarching imperial authority had withdrawn from the southern part of the island. So that's one possible connection with this part of the world. That imperial authority does have certain advantages in moderating interethnic tension and conflict within its territories, and when it's lifted, then interethnic violence or conflict reemerges. And I guess one example of that would be in when the former Yugoslavia disintegrated in the 1990s. We had war in the Balkans again. Whatever you think about it, it may be that the authority of the Yugoslav state ought to have disintegrated, but it created problems. The second possible connection is in thinking of the European Union as a kind of imperial project. I don't think the European Union is quite an empire, but it's like an empire in certain respects. Like an empire, the European Union does have a dominant power, Germany, and even if the dominant power doesn't threaten violence against less powerful members of the European Union, it does exercise power and sometimes coercion. So, for example, in the financial crisis of 2007 to 8, Germany forced Greece to adopt a policy of austerity, which the Greek government didn't want, and it also imposed a government of technocrats on Italy. That may have been bloodless, it wasn't violent, but it did involve superior power, which was exercised. And it was resented, both by Greeks and Italians. The quasi-imperial nature of the European Union bears upon the vote of my own people, the British, to leave the European Union 6 years ago in 2016. One of the classic challenges facing any empire is how to strengthen central cohesion while accommodating the desire of its constituent parts for local autonomy. So the centre needs power for the whole to be cohesive, to act as one, but of course the various parts that comprise the whole, they want local autonomy, and so there's always tension between central cohesion and local autonomy within an empire, as there is within the European Union. So according to some colleagues in Britain, the European Court of Justice is not an impartial arbiter of European law. It's an instrument of the imperial goal of ever closer union, and in the name of that purpose, according to some critics, it has overridden the wording of legal texts of international treaties. And the impact of that, of course, is it makes states subscribing to treaties more distrustful of signing treaties, because if you sign a treaty, you expect the wording of the treaty to be obeyed, and according to some critics, that has been overridden by the European Court of Justice, and therefore national trust in international treaties within the European Union is weakened. And it also undermines the domestic confidence in national government by exposing its impotence to uphold the democratic will expressed in parliamentary decisions. So one of the greatest irritations in the run-up to Brexit in 2016 was caused by the EU's fourth freedom, fourth pillar, its freedom of movement, because we couldn't control how many EU citizens were coming into Britain, and it seemed as if that meant that British employers were not bothering to train unemployed Britons to work, rather employing cheap labour from Europe, and it also created pressures on local government to provide services and also on housing. And so just before the referendum vote, the British Prime Minister tried to persuade his European colleagues to allow some suspension of freedom of movement. That was denied, and that was one of the reasons that the British voted to leave. because we couldn't control our borders. So I think perhaps the issue of quasi-imperial control and local autonomy is something that may be relevant to you, and that's a common problem that all empires face, and the British Empire certainly faced that. So let me stop there and allow Dr. Hunyadi to try and make further connections.
I'm very pleased to have a conversation with you in this circle, and I congratulate for this book, because last year it was a bestseller in the non-fiction category, being sold out more than 25,000 copies. And I can read here the titles of your more than 14 books, and they promise very, very, very nice topics. For instance, the ethic of nation, between kin and cosmopolis, an ethic of the nation. And let me start with a question that concerns us, Transylvanian Hungarians, or Transylvanians in general, since you mentioned the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman rule, and also mentioned 1707, the British Union. And I know you consider yourself of Scottish origin.
I am.
And I asked you if you think that language and national identity has any connections. Because as far as we know, no one was forced during the Habsburg Empire to give up its native language. But on the contrary, unfortunately, even if the Scottish people retained its Calvinist or Reformed religion, they somehow lost their language, their Gaelic language, and that happened also with the Irish people. What is your opinion about this?
Yeah. So, first of all, nations are complicated. Scotland has been, or was an independent kingdom from about the 10th century, as was England. So Scotland was long independent until it joined in the union that created Britain in 1707. During its history, Scotland had been parts of Scotland were ruled from Norway. So at some point, people living in northwest Scotland spoke Norwegian or Norse. By the 18th century, people in my part of Scotland, in the south, nearest England, spoke a form of English. The language was basically English, though English people would have a hard time understanding it. But it is basically English. But Gaelic, it was quite different from English. It's similar to Irish. Was spoken only in the northwest of the country, because there was a rebellion in 1745 that the government, the Hanoverian government in London, crushed, and after that. The culture of Highland Scots, language, their clothing, their social structure was suppressed. So Gaelic language was suppressed. But here's the complication. It wasn't simply a matter of English suppressing the Scots. It was a matter of English and lowland Protestant farming English-speaking Scots suppressing Highland, Catholic, cattle rustling, feudal Scots. So it wasn't a simple English, it wasn't a binary English versus Scottish thing. It was more complicated than that. But in Ireland, yes, for similar reasons, Catholic, culture and Gaelic culture was long suppressed. And actually the suppression gave rise to a sense of Irish, Irish nationality. Often a concept of one's nationhood is often in reaction to something someone else is doing you don't like. So the English suppressed Catholic Gaelic culture, and Catholic Gaelic peoples who often been different peoples found a common cause in opposing the English. Yeah.
And in the long term, for instance, Ireland celebrated almost 102 years since their independence.
Yes.
That started during the First World War with the Easter uprising or upheaval. But what is your opinion about the Tony Blair administration devolution? So nowadays, after the devolution, 25 years since the Devolution Act, is there any Scottish regional identity that is besides the British identity? They ran together in tandem, or are there any conflicts, mainly after the Brexit?
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, first of all, nations can take different forms. So when Scotland and England were united in 1707, the Scots retained their own church. They retained a legal system which is much more common to continental Europe than to England. And they retained their own education system and their own culture. So Scots, even within Britain, Scots have always retained their own identity. So when I'm with English people, they call me English, I'll say, no, I'm Scots. However, if I'm with Scottish people, they call me, I often say I'm English. My mother was English, my father was Scottish. I was born in Scotland, educated in England. I'm British. British is a meta-identity, like European. It's a meta-identity. So in Scotland, Scots have always retained a sense of their own identity. Devolution meant that for the first time Scotland had a parliament of its own for the first time since 1707. And Wales, which hadn't had an independent parliament since, well, Wales never had a parliament because it was never one state. But Wales was conquered by England in the 13th century. But Welsh language has survived, and in fact, again, ironically, within Britain, Welsh language flourishes more than Irish language flourishes in independent Ireland. I don't understand why, but it does. So you'll find more people in Wales speaking Welsh within Britain than you'll find Irish people speaking Irish within Ireland. I lived in Ireland for 4 years. Every Irish person has to learn Irish as well as English at school. You can't teach or be a civil servant without a basic level of Irish. But except in very western parts of Ireland, no one speaks it. So the point is that national autonomy can take different forms. You can keep cultural autonomy, legal autonomy, educational autonomy without having a foreign policy, without having your own diplomats. So independence and dependence comes in grades.
I understand. This book has a chapter with the title Cultural Assimilation and Genocide. And you also mentioned Cecil Rhodes and genocide or ethnocide.
Yes.
And unfortunately, we still have ethnocidal governmental policies, mainly in Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, or Burma, or Eastern Pakistan,
Yes.
and so on. And let me quote from this chapter, Cultural Assimilation and Genocide. When the people of one culture meets another and dominates it in number and power, only three outcomes are possible. Either the dominant people annihilates the dominated one, or the latter adapts and assimilates, or the two, or thirdly, the two people separate. Can you give us some examples of these three cases? Whether, if you speak in your books about the credit and the debit column of colonization.
Yeah.
So tell me something about this chapter, because let me tell another sentence. There is a theory of Michael Hector of internal colonialism, and here in Romania, after the First World War, Constantin Iordache, our colleague, a historian, also published a lot about the colonization of ethnic Romanians in Dobruja after it was gained from Turkey, and colonization of workers or peasants, because colonialism in extension means colonizing colons or peasants somewhere. It is different from diaspora, that was the habit of the Greeks who populated uninhabited
Yes.
or these kind of regions. So returning, what do you consider ethnocide or genocide? And what do you consider as cultural assimilation? Is it a positive noun, that's cultural assimilation, as opposite to this destructive noun, the genocide or ethnocide?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are really important, difficult questions. So I say that thinking about Europeans arriving in North America, Australia, or even Africa, with their technologically and scientifically superior culture, three outcomes are possible. Either the Europeans annihilate native peoples, or the native peoples assimilate, or they separate. In actual fact, sometimes it was a bit of both, so a bit of assimilation with a bit of separation. But my reading of the British Empire is that there was never an intentional annihilation of a people. In North America in particular and Australia, native peoples were often decimated by disease because Europeans brought, because Europeans had been accustomed to living with domestic animals, they become immune to certain diseases that North Americans and Aboriginal Australians were not. So when the Europeans arrived, these diseases spread and they just decimated peoples. And some peoples were annihilated, but by disease, not by intention. And a very vital question when talking about genocide is, what do you mean by it? If you mean the annihilation of a people, then yes, genocide took place, but speaking as an ethicist, and also if I were an international lawyer, I would say genocide has to be intentional. You intend to annihilate a people. And my reading of British imperial history is that never happened. So that was never part of any policy. There was one occasion in Canada where the governor proposed that the Native Americans be put onto an island so they could flourish by themselves and they wouldn't have to encounter settlers. So that would be a policy of separation, but Christian humanitarians, among others, lobbied the London government to stop that, and it was stopped. So there was no policy of separation in Canada. The one place where we all know the separation of Europeans and natives took place was South Africa, apartheid, which means separation. But that happened after South Africa had left the British Commonwealth. Now, assimilation is controversial because the complaints of Native American peoples in Canada and Australia is that whites sought to eliminate native culture. And this was a kind of cultural genocide. I myself think we shouldn't use the word genocide to describe that because it confuses things. I think what happened sometimes was, yes, there was the indiscriminate contempt for native cultures, And my own view is that no culture deserves indiscriminate contempt. Some cultures can be superior to others in certain respects. And in, for example, in Western Canada in the 1880s, the native peoples survived on killing buffalo or bison. That was their basic economy. In the 1870s and 1880s, because of overkilling, the bison populations collapsed, and the economic basis for traditional native life vanished. And at that point, and indeed before, native peoples lobbied the Canadian government to provide schools and reservations where they could be protected from settler invasion, and they could learn to adapt gradually, learning English and learning agriculture. And colonial governments in New Zealand and Australia and Canada provided education and reserves for native peoples to live on temporarily while they assimilated. But the idea for assimilation was so people could survive and adapt to a new way of life that they couldn't avoid. In South Africa in the 1850s, in New Zealand in the 1860s, and in Canada in the 1880s, black Africans, Maori and Native Americans were granted the vote on the same terms as whites. Now, in those days, you had to qualify for the vote by having a certain income or a certain education, but then even in England in the 1880s, most white people couldn't vote. But in principle, the idea was that native peoples assimilate to a Europeanized society on equal terms. It didn't always work out that way, but that was the principle.
Thank you. May we turn a little bit to Christianity or theology or ethics?
Please do.
Because you always made a reference to ethics. In your opinion, is there any international ethics? Because you mentioned that national trust fell.
Yes.
Concerning the treaties, because the European Commission behaves like an emperor or chancellor of an empire. So are there any clues of having an international law based on ethics or theology?
Okay. So as a Christian, I am bound to believe that there are universal moral principles. That the world is not only physically coherent, which it is, but also morally coherent. One of the implications of believing in one God is that the world God has created is coherent, not just physically, also morally. So there are universal moral principles. In Catholic tradition, it's called natural law. Protestants talk about created order. So as a Christian, I am, as it were, dogmatically committed to that. But I think empirically, we can find evidence of that. So, for example, 9 years ago, I went to Hong Kong to a conference discussing the ethics of war. And I went there with knowing the Western Christian tradition of justified war. Under what conditions is going to war legitimate, and when you're fighting a war, what's just and what's unjust. But when I got there, I read about and heard about ancient and medieval Chinese Confucian ethics of war, and I was really struck by the similarities. So these two traditions of the ethics of war developed entirely independently, because China and the Latin West have very little connection with each other, some trade but not much, until the modern period. And yet, in spite of being entirely independent, that they developed very similar moral views. So I think there's empirical evidence that human beings from widely different cultures can actually, in spite of differences, understand each other. They may not always agree, but they can find sufficient commonality to be able to understand each other. So my view as a Christian ethicist is that there are moral principles, and even where there is no law, where there's no positive law, no international law, there are principles that peoples can recognize. And I think that's what's known even in legal terms as the law of nations. This is not the law that derives from treaties, it's the law that derives from customs and from the mutual recognition of moral principles. You can still have even in a world where there's no international law, no courts, no treaties, peoples can still recognize some moral principles in common.
You also have a book about cosmopolis, between kin and cosmopolis. And you spoke about a meta-identity. Do you think that besides the British identity, is there a Christian universal meta-identity that could, for instance, make peace between Orthodox Christianity and Western Christianity? What is your opinion about the Huntington thesis, clash of civilizations?
Right.
I tell this because you wrote about cosmopolis.
Yeah.
And what happens if a ruler like Hitler or Putin break these rules? We have here the thesis of Hannah Arendt, or we have the ethics of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who tells us that if somebody, a ruler, breaks the rules, then what must a Christian do? Can we fight against him? Because colonialism is always about resistance against assimilation, resistance against imperialism. That's what Hannah Arendt told us in the Roots of Totalitarianism. Because this book has 3 chapters that starts with imperialism. So she always tells us about Cecil Rhodes and British colonialism that used to be the roots of racism, and that led to totalitarian regimes. That's her idea. What's yours?
I don't agree.
You don't agree?
Not with Hannah. Not from what you say. I don't agree with Hannah.
You also mentioned the genocide committed by Cecil Rhodes in Africa.
Well, no. I mentioned some people accuse him of genocide. But the accusation
that was not a fact.
No, because in 1896, he and his people were involved in a war with the Ndebele in southern Africa, where lots of Ndebele were killed, but they weren't annihilated. And in fact, when he was buried in what was then Rhodesia, the Ndebele lined the hills and saluted him, and they then in fact guarded his grave for decades afterwards. So in that case, genocide wasn't appropriate.
So what happens if a ruler breaks the rules?
Which rules? Moral or legal?
International law, for instance. Let's talk about the recent development in Ukraine.
Just going back to the issue of cosmopolis. Yes. I mean, as a Christian, I am bound to recognize that my nation is not God. I mean, nations come and go, frankly. Britain didn't exist until 360 years ago. The US didn't exist until 1787. Czechoslovakia came and went. So nations are not forever. There may be features of nations that deserve to be preserved. So I can't worship my nation. I think I'm against Scottish independence because I believe in Britain as a multinational state, that it serves certain goods. But I have to acknowledge that ultimately my loyalty is to God, and notwithstanding my British identity, I have duties and connections with other peoples too. But what I don't believe in, I don't believe, as I think some liberal Catholics believe in, that we ought all to be heading for some kind of world government, some cosmopolis where there's a single government, and that's the way to avoid warfare. I don't believe that will ever happen, and I think actually what we should be looking for is to extend international law. But even then, even if when there's international law, there will always be conflict over the interpretation of law. And so, I mean, that happened in the case of Kosovo. And as a moralist, I have to say, sometimes it may be right to break the law, depending what the law is.
Do you think that there is also a fourth way?
Tell me.
Because you mentioned the extermination of the bisons as a vital basis of the Native Americans, and a lot of natives nowadays think that they were pushed out of their original lifespan, and imperialism, that is maybe a synonym for colonialism, used to be a broad term that referred to economic, military and political domination. So you argued here that once a people wants to dominate, but isn't there any example when there are three ethnic groups living in the neighborhood of each other? So your assumption was that when the people of one culture meets another and dominates it in number and power, are there, for instance, Switzerland, where neither of the three parts or four parts wants to dominate the other? You mentioned also Germany wishing to dominate the whole European Union, pushing their rules on Italy, pushing their rules on Greece, and for instance now on Poland and Hungary. Are there fourth examples like a federation, confederation,
Yes.
like Switzerland or
Okay. No, you're quite right.
or Transylvania?
You tell me. So no, you're quite right. So when I wrote that, I wasn't thinking of Switzerland or the European Union. I was thinking of North America in 1700, of Australia in 1800, where Europeans arrive on territories where there don't seem to be stable states with borders and gates. Where the encounter is much more fluid and uncertain, and there's no treaty. But you're quite right. So you can arrive at a political agreement whereby the superior power of the dominant, the dominant power is constrained by law or procedure,
Or by God.
Or by God. but I guess my view is that asymmetries of inequality of power is a fact of life.
So you think there is a drive towards domination? That's a very Charles Darwinian theory.
Well, I think that there's a drive to domination insofar as in a world where you're not secure, if you want to be secure, you want to dominate your environment. Now, so I think there's a drive to domination insofar as there's a drive to be secure. But I just think that there will always be certain states that are more powerful than others, which will dominate. And in my lifetime, the United States dominates, and it's dominated British culture for good and ill for all of my lifetime, and it's a fact. Now we can moderate that. But I think the attempt to create a world where every state is equal is utopian. So the goal should be to teach those who have superior power to use it well and justly, not unjustly, and maybe to create international law and maybe even federations or states where the inequalities of power are moderated and regulated. That's probably the best we can hope for.
You were involved in a Cecil Rhodes statue issue, and here in Cluj you have the Rogers Brubaker and Fleischmidt Margaret book about an ethnicized city. You saw the statue
Yes.
of a revolutionary hero appears in the front of the Orthodox Cathedral. But there are some personalities that were, even if Cecil Rhodes has a scholarship,
Yes.
and there is a Rhodesian University, there were claims to change its name. And we have the $20 or so, and George Washington and all the presidents
Yes.
before the abolition of the slavery were slave tenants also. So a lot of schools changed the name of this. For instance, Andrew Jackson, who is the president, who met with Bölöni Farkas Sándor in the 1820s, the schools were bearing his name were changed with another, Samantha Jackson, for instance.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion about this counter
This iconoclasm.
iconoclasm? Yes.
Yes. Well, unsurprisingly, I'm largely against it. I mean, I think, yes, if there were statues to Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler, I would prefer to have them taken down. But otherwise, any person we admire for what they did is a sinner. You will find parts of their lives that are not so admirable. Winston Churchill was great during Second World War, but his views of the empire were very reactionary. Mahatma Gandhi was admirable because of his non-violent resistance to British rule in India, but Mahatma Gandhi, like many Indians, had a rather poor view of Africans, a rather racist view of Africans. If you go to Washington, in central Washington, there's a lake called the Basin. At the bottom of the lake, there's a very impressive statue or monument to Martin Luther King, and that, of course, the monument is to Martin Luther King as the leader of the civil rights movement, rights for American blacks. But Martin Luther King was also sexually unfaithful. He betrayed his wife many times. The monument is not raised to Martin Luther King as an unfaithful man. It's raised to Martin Luther King as a civil rights champion. And so, when we raise monuments to people, we're not saying this person was a saint. We're saying this person was remarkable because he did X. And I think if we want heroes, we need to live with flawed heroes, because there are no perfect ones. And in terms of Washington and slavery in the 1700s, we've got to take on board the fact that slave trading and slavery was a universal institution. Everyone did it. And in Jamaica in the 1700s, when slaves escaped from the plantations into the forested mountains, some of them kept slaves of their own. And when I was my wife is American, and we were visiting her family in Raleigh, North Carolina in January, and I went to the Museum of the History of the State of North Carolina and discovered that in 1860, on the eve of the American Civil War, there were 30,000 freed slaves in the state of North Carolina, some of whom kept slaves of their own. So slavery and slave trading was a universal institution. And so the fact that Washington and other founders of America were slave owners was we may lament it, but it wasn't unusual. And it shouldn't be made to erase ones that were admiration for them for what they did in terms of building one of the most liberal and prosperous states on earth. So it's partly a matter of accepting flawed heroes, but also let's put the sins of our ancestors in context.
Thank you. I want to open the floor for questions for the public. So please formulate your questions, and you will receive a microphone. Your opera is great. I congratulate. You also have a book. Let me ask you. Its title is "In Defense of War." What is it about?
It's the reason for the title is it's a rather irritated reaction against some of my Christian ethics colleagues who I sometimes feel don't grapple, don't face political realities, and so that was the reason for the polemical title. But the book is about the Christian tradition of justified warfare, which begins with St. Augustine roughly in the 400s AD and develops in Western Christianity, is developed by Spanish scholastics in the 1600s. The Protestant theologian and jurist Hugo Grotius adopted it, and part of it came into international law. And then after the Second World War, it was revived, particularly in America. So the book's designed to introduce people to that tradition of Christian thinking about when war is justified and when it isn't.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you for the opportunity for questioning, sir. Is there any solution by which interethnic conflicts could be maybe evaded via emphasizing a common imperial heritage?
A common
Imperial heritage.
Imperial heritage.
Or legacy.
Yeah. Well, okay. Sometimes within an empire, and actually, the distinction between a nation state and an empire is not clear here, because many nation states begin life, they expand, they have an imperial phase, and then they become nation states. So England began as the kingdom of the West Saxons, and then expanded. So over time, when you have an imperial state, people do develop, depending on whether the state finds favour or not, they do identify with it. So there are people who are, in my country, who are both English and Welsh and Scottish and Northern Irish, who identify with the British state. So a common state and time and the benefits of a common state can create an identity that moderates, as it were, more original ethnic identities. So the English and the Scottish and the Welsh are very aware of their own identities, and when they play football matches, they want their team to win, and they have all sorts of jokes about the other people. So the sense of identity remains, but it's contained and moderated by a larger sense of common identity. And the same could happen in Europe when people develop a European identity. And indeed, in America, before the American War of Independence in the 1770s, you had 13 different states, colonies, many of whom were fiercely independent of the other. But the war and then a common constitution created a new American identity. So I think yes, not just imperial authority, but as it were, imperial structures and the experience of living together under an imperial authority can create a common identity.
I see. Thank you. I have just one more question. Do you think there could be any chance for a reconciliation, maybe between the anti-colonial discourse and the, how should I say, colonial apologetic discourse on the topic, based on maybe a common agreement in the foreseeable future?
Yes, well, yeah. In principle, yes. I mean, there are people who disagree about these things, who can talk to one another. The problem is that in my experience, the left-wing anti-colonialists are very aggressive and, to my mind, dogmatic. So someone has written a 15,000-word critique of my book, and in 15,000 words, he has absolutely nothing good to say about it. Now, maybe it deserves it, but there are plenty of other people who have found good things to say about it. But taking this fellow as an example, the hostility is so overwhelming, it's very hard to get a conversation to go. So in principle, yes, and there are people you can talk about these things, but it's quite hard to find them so far.
On another abstract manner of relevance towards Romania, Hungary, and in general to the macro-region of Central and Eastern Europe and its imperial legacy, can maybe the EU learn from the legacy of the British Commonwealth as some kind of a supranational entity that shares a common moral heritage, and could the EU be inspired from the British Commonwealth in constructing a common or shared identity?
Well, it could, but it wouldn't want to, because the lesson it would learn is to drop the project of ever closer union. Because in about 1900, British imperialists were very aware that Germany and the United States were growing in power, and there was a project to create a federal union between Britain, Canada, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand, so that there would be a kind of an imperial parliament with a common foreign policy, so a kind of imperial federation modelled on the United States. But the Canada, Australia, South Africa and New Zealand didn't want it. So what happened was, instead of federating, it loosened into a voluntary association of independent states called the Commonwealth. So the equivalent of that would have been the European Economic Community, an alliance of independent states. The difference has been the political project to create what is in effect a new European nation out of the member states of the European Union, to stand against the United States on the one hand and Russia and China on the other. So I think the lesson would be, don't go there.
Thank you very much for your
answer. Because if it hadn't been for that, Britain would not have pulled out.
Any other questions, please? Be courageous.
Thank you for your presentation. I would like to enter into the moral side of your presentation. Quite often nowadays, when we hear about colonization or gender equality, we have an argument which is saying like power is bad, power is not good. Is that true? Power is all the times bad because it gives you dominion over the others, or there are some sort of power which is good or can be good?
No, that's a really important question, because there is, if you're a disciple of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, power is bad and hierarchy is bad, by which he means their power is bad. No, I mean, we all want power, because without power we can't achieve anything, right? We all want power. My view is that in human life, and in political life and international life, some people, some institutions, some states have more power than others. Different kinds of power. If we are threatened by another state, then of course we want more power than them because we don't want them to dominate us. Personally, I don't want China to dominate the world, personally. There's nothing wrong with power as such, but the moral question is the goals or the ends to which we put our power, what we want to achieve with it, and then what are the limits on the means we'll use. So those are the moral questions. The ends and the means. But power itself, without power we can't rescue the poor. Without power we can't emancipate slaves. Without power we can't rescue the innocent. We need power. But thank you for asking the question, because in a lot of discourse it's assumed that power is bad, which usually means other people's power is bad, mine's okay.
Please, András.
Thank you. My question would be that at the end, based on your conclusions, is there any act committed by the British Empire which would qualify, based on your conclusions, as genocide?
No.
Okay, so my follow-up question is, why don't you consider genocidal acts when children were taken from the families? Meanwhile, the Genocidal Act from 1948 considers this action as one of the acts which qualifies genocide. So when deliberately from one group the children were taken and given to the other group, this qualifies legally as genocide. And it happened under the British Empire.
Yeah, okay. So I argue for a narrow definition of genocide. The paradigm of genocide is Auschwitz. Yeah, and that's what when Raphael Lemkin was developing ideas about a convention on genocide, that's what he had in mind in the 1940s. So a systematic, an intentional desire to annihilate a whole people. Now, the removal of Aboriginal children, or in Canada the equivalent is the attendance by Native American children in residential schools. They were removed from their families in residential schools. In both cases, the aim was to enable a new generation of Aboriginals and Native Americans to learn English, to learn agriculture, to earn a wage, because the old ways had disappeared. So the aim was to assimilate in order to survive. That's not genocide. Now, it doesn't mean the means by which this was done can be criticised. It may have been too brutal. I don't know about the Australian case. If children were forcibly removed from their parents, that could be criticised. In Canada, participation in residential schools was voluntary until 1920. And even after that, Native Canadians were lobbying the government for more residential schools. So the means can be criticised. And sometimes if as I said earlier, sometimes native culture was indiscriminately dismissed or denigrated. That wasn't right either. But I wouldn't call it genocide. Because the aim was not to annihilate a people, the aim was to enable people to adapt and survive.
Somewhere you mentioned, sorry for a new question, but please think about new questions. Milner, a Canadian governor, I think.
South African.
Yes?
South African.
South African.
Yeah.
And in the conclusions of the colonial past. But I read somewhere that the reserves, or you also mentioned, were an intermediate stage towards the assimilation of Native Americans.
Yes.
But if you put on the balance the debt and the credits, you argue that there are more positive credits of colonialism, of at least Pax Britannica style colonialism, than the debt.
No.
Compared to the Spanish rule or anything else.
No,
Or I understood wrong.
No, it's not quite. No, I say you can't weigh these things up. All you can say is it contained both. It wasn't like Nazism, and there were, both in terms of a humanitarian concern for native peoples, there wasn't much in the 1600s, 1700s, partly starting with the movement to abolish slavery in the late 1700s. There was a growing concern about the plight of native peoples, and then there was this liberal concern that the territories under British rule would gradually have to become independent. But even to the end of its life, the British Empire contained bad things. But then my view is all states do. Yeah.
Any more questions? Opinions?
I had two questions. The first one is that isn't racism and slave ownership a kind of capital sin in today's culture? And so we can understand why there are many people who try to, I don't know, to help us forget about it, some kind of forgetting, because it became a cultural taboo. And there are some people who remind us about this, I don't know, not common sin of, but which we all did it together.
Yeah.
And if there is a bill which has a face of somebody who was a slave owner, it reminds them. And I think it's a little bit more understandable if somebody's heritage was on the bad side of racism and slave ownership, for example. And maybe then it's a little bit understandable. And the second question is a little bit related, about statues.
Yeah.
As I understood about how you talked about it, it was a little bit utilitarian. Is utilitarianism a good system about talking about these things? Or what kind of ethical system is good to talk about them? Because for me it seems a little bit weird, because if I think about them in virtue ethics, in the terms of virtue ethics, well, being unfaithful isn't really nice, but you did help them. But in utilitarian terms it's a little bit easier, because you did a great deal of good, and the bad wasn't so big.
I see. I see. Yeah. Okay. That's probably a good point. So, serial infidelity is not as bad. I mean, it's bad, but it's. But I'm not sure. I do get that. How do you weigh? I mean, yes. So Martin Luther King's infidelity harmed fewer people. Only a few people, maybe his wife, a few others. Whereas his civil rights movement emancipated lots. Yes, I guess you could think of it in those terms. But still, I mean, what about Gandhi's racism? So Gandhi is admired for his non-violent resistance, and yet he had very poor views of Africans. Do you say that this outweighs that? I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can. And if you're an African, you probably shouldn't. You wouldn't say that therefore makes. And certainly a lot of the anti-colonialists some years ago, they were calling for Gandhi to be demoted from the pantheon of Western heroes. So it may be that maybe it makes sense to say that the reason we keep the statue up there is because he did more good than bad. I just think the good and bad are very different kinds, and we admire this person in spite of some things. But the statue wasn't erected to the statue doesn't mean that he's being admired for his infidelity. It means he's being admired for his civil rights movement. When we erect a statue to someone, it's for something particular they did, not for everything they did. In terms of your earlier point about the face of a former slave owner on a banknote. Yes, and so a black African American might be offended by that. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, maybe. I have to think about that.
For instance, we also feel solidarity with those assimilated because in 20th century Romania, according to the internal colonialist theory, for instance, the German-speaking population was whether totally assimilated or sold out from Romania. The Jews as well were sold out for Israel. So I personally can feel sorry about those Irish people and Scottish who lost their language. This is the debt column. Yeah. And we can conclude with the poem of our greatest, one of the greatest poet who wrote, Arany János, who wrote a poem about the bards of Wales. And he compares King Edward with Franz Joseph, who destroyed the Hungarian independence war by inviting the Russian Tsar with its army of 200,000 troops and invaded Hungary. And so the Bards of Wales was projected on the Tower of Cardiff some years ago when we celebrated 200 years since Arany János was born.
Okay.
And so you think that if there is a war with a lot of sacrifices and lives compared to 3 counties, can we put on the balance, for instance, the dismantling of one country that happened with Hungary or nowadays Ukraine, with the sacrifice of more million people dying for an idea, for a nation state. From an ethic point of view, what can we do?
So, in terms of Ukraine,
for instance,
yeah,
and we conclude with all this.
Okay. So, on the issue of war, it has to be true that oftentimes fewer people would suffer if wars were never fought. Arguably, I think, though you may disagree with the figure, I read somewhere that between 60 and 80 million people died during the Second World War. Very high price to pay. Arguably, if Hitler had not been opposed, many few people would have died. I just think there are certain regimes that are so ruthlessly unjust. It's worth resisting with the loss of life. How many lives are worth losing to resist Hitler? You know, if it was 60 million, would it have been worth twice that? I don't know how to answer that question. As for Ukraine, I mean, you and I disagree a little. My basic view is Ukraine may never recover Crimea or the Donbass. I'm open to whatever settlement there is. My bottom line is I think President Putin needs to learn not to do this again. Not to the Baltic states, not to Poland, not again. So whatever it takes to make this invasion fail needs to be done. But that is costing a lot of lives.
Thank you very much, Professor Nigel Biggar. I will buy this book and I recommend all your books for the audience. Thank you for your patience and sorry for being so late, but I hope it was a pleasant discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We welcome you again in Transylvania.
Thank you.